dark screens, silent phones, crowded streets. Iran is burning in the dark. Hundreds are dead. Thousands are detained. No one knows the real number because the internet is gone. This is not chaos by accident. This is a system under pressure, a collapsing currency, an economy crushed by sanctions, an authoritarian state that responds to anger with force. And then, from outside the country, a signal. Donald Trump says the United States is ready to help. Tehran answers with a warning. Intervene, and American targets become fair game. This is the moment when a domestic protest stops being domestic, when economic pain turns political, when political unrest turns geopolitical risk. If you want to understand how countries unravel, this is one you cannot ignore. Stay with me, because what's happening in Iran is not just about Iran. To see why this explosion was almost inevitable, we need to step back and clearly define what this crisis really is. This is not a spontaneous uprising, and it is not simply about politics. At its core, this crisis is about pressure, economic pressure, social pressure, and a political system that absorbs stress until it suddenly cannot. Iran's currency has collapsed to record lows. That is not an abstract statistic. It means savings evaporate, prices spike, and daily life becomes unpredictable. When shopkeepers walk into the streets, that is a warning sign. When protests spread across major cities, that is escalation. When the state responds with mass arrests and internet blackouts, that is fear. The government calls protesters rioters and foreign mercenaries. Protesters see themselves as citizens pushed past endurance. Both sides believe they are defending survival. And this matters because authoritarian systems depend on control. Control of money, control of information, control of narrative. Once those controls weaken at the same time, stability becomes fragile. To understand how Iran reached this point, we need to look backward at the forces that built this pressure over time. This did not begin this year, and it did not begin on the streets. It began in cycles. Iran's economy has been under strain for years. Sanctions hit oil exports. Revenue shrank. The state compensated by tightening control, not reforming structure. When oil money falls, the system does not become flexible. It becomes defensive. The rial weakens. Imports become expensive. Inflation creeps into food, fuel, rent. At first, people adapt. They cut spending. They wait. Then the currency hits a record low. And waiting stops working. History matters here. Iran has seen this pattern before. Economic shock, public anger. Security response, each time the state survives. But each cycle leaves less trust behind. By 2022 and 2023, that trust was already thin. The death of Mahsa Amini turned social control into a national trauma. The protests were suppressed, but the memory remained. So when the economy cracked again, the reaction was faster and angrier. And that set the stage for the first explosion. The first explosion was not planned, but it was inevitable. When the rial collapsed, shopkeepers closed their stores. Then they opened their mouths. Then they walked into the streets. That moment mattered because shopkeepers are not activists. They are signals. They move only when survival is threatened. The protests spread fast. Tehran, Mashhad, major cities. The response was faster. Arrests, force, and then silence. The internet went dark. That blackout was not about security. It was about control. When information disappears, power reasserts itself. But here is the paradox. Cutting communication slows coordination. It also multiplies anger. Human rights groups report hundreds dead, thousands detained, women, children. Exact numbers are unknown. And that uncertainty is the point. If you are watching this and thinking, I've seen this before, you're right. because this is the moment when a government stops managing unrest and starts containing a threat. If you want to understand what the system is really protecting, stay with me, because next we need to expose the mechanism behind the violence. What you are seeing is not panic, it is design. Authoritarian systems do not collapse suddenly. They harden when pressure rises. The response is not negotiation, it is insulation. First, control the economy, subsidies, restrictions, blame sanctions. Second, control information, blackouts, media framing, silence. Third, redefine the threat. Protesters become rioters. Citizens become foreign mercenaries. Dissent becomes treason. This is how legitimacy is preserved without consent. Violence in this system is not failure. It is communication. It sends a message inward. Fear works. And a message outward. Escalation will be costly. That is why warnings follow repression. American bases named as targets. Israel folded into the threat. The state is not only crushing protest, it is raising the price of intervention. And this is where danger compounds. Because once repression and deterrence merge, mistakes become catastrophic. The next shock does not come from the streets. It comes from the outside. And that brings us to the second crisis. The second crisis begins with words, not missiles, not troops. Words. From Washington, Donald Trump signals readiness to help, a message aimed at protesters, but heard very differently in Tehran, because in this region, words are not abstract. They are probes. Iran answers immediately, intervene, and American bases, ships, and allies become legitimate targets. This is escalation without movement, threat without action, and it is dangerous. Remember the context. Just months earlier, the United States struck 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. That memory shapes every calculation. So when Trump speaks of freedom, Iran hears regime change. When Iran speaks of defense, the region hears war. This is how domestic unrest internationalizes. Not through invasion, through signaling. Each side believes it is deterring the other. Each side narrows the room for compromise. And the protesters, they are caught in the middle, used as symbols, but paying the real price. This is the moment when crises stop being controllable. Because once great powers speak, local suffering becomes global risk. And now we have to look at who absorbs that risk first. If you live inside Iran, this is not geopolitics. This is your life. You wake up to a weaker currency. You go to sleep with no internet. You step outside knowing a protest could turn deadly. You are not choosing ideology. You are choosing dignity. Prices rise faster than wages. Savings lose meaning. The future feels smaller every day. And when you speak, you are told you are a rioter, or worse, a traitor. This is the quiet violence of instability. Not bombs, not headlines, but exhaustion. Families wait for news that never comes. Phones stay silent. Fear fills the gaps. If you are watching this from afar, do not reduce this to slogans. These are ordinary people, trapped between power and punishment. If you believe their voices matter, share this, talk about it, pay attention. Because when people disappear into silence, silence becomes policy. And what happens next will not stay contained. It never does. What happens in Iran never stays inside Iran. Because Iran sits at the center of too many fault lines: energy, security, ideology. When instability rises here, markets listen, oil reacts, allies reposition, rivals recalibrate. Threats against American bases are not rhetoric. They force military planning. They raise insurance costs. They pull regional actors closer to conflict posture. Israel watches carefully. The Gulf states hedge. Every signal is interpreted through the lens of escalation. And remember this, the United States has already struck Iranian nuclear facilities. That fact alone shortens the fuse. So a domestic protest becomes a regional variable. A human rights crisis becomes a strategic dilemma. If Washington intervenes, it risks war. If it stays silent, it risks credibility. There is no clean option. This is how local unrest reshapes global order. Not overnight, but through accumulation. Pressure builds, misjudgments multiply, and the system drifts closer to rupture. To understand where this road leads, we have to look forward at the futures now taking shape. There are three futures ahead. None are clean. The first is containment. Protests are crushed. The internet returns slowly. Fear replaces momentum. The state survives, but at a cost. More repression, less legitimacy, a society quieter but more brittle. The second future is stalemate. Protests do not topple the system, but they do not disappear either. The economy remains weak, anger simmers, periodic unrest becomes normal. This is instability without resolution, a slow bleed, dangerous because it feels manageable until it isn't. The third future is escalation, a miscalculation, an intervention, a strike that triggers response. Domestic unrest becomes external conflict. The region ignites, and ordinary Iranians pay the highest price. History teaches us something uncomfortable. Systems rarely choose reform under pressure. They choose force, and outsiders rarely control the consequences of intervention. They inherit them. So the real question is not what Iran will do or what America will do. It is whether the system allows a fourth future at all. And that brings us to the final insight. This crisis teaches one hard lesson. When economic collapse meets political rigidity, societies don't break loudly. They fracture silently. Iran today is not just facing protests. It is facing a legitimacy test, one it has postponed for years. Force can restore order. It cannot restore trust. External pressure can signal values. It cannot engineer outcomes. And the most dangerous moment is not rebellion. It is misinterpretation. When leaders believe control equals stability, when outsiders believe intervention equals solution, if you are watching this, understand this. What happens in Iran is not an anomaly. It is a preview of what occurs when systems refuse to adapt, when economics are ignored, when people are managed instead of heard. This story is not finished. It is unfolding. If you want to understand where global power is shifting, why unrest keeps returning, and how fragile order really is, stay with me. Share this and watch what comes next. Because the next crisis will not announce itself.